The real estate agent said the house needed work. He said it the way agents say things they are required to say, but prefer not to dwell on quickly moving toward the next room before the words had time to settle with the particular forward momentum of a man who has learned that the best way past an uncomfortable fact is through it. Needs work. 2 words doing the work of 20. He did not mention the room. Willa Foss was 64 years old. She was a retired emergency room nurse, and she had spent 31 years in the specific discipline of noticing what was wrong before anyone told her what to look for. She stood in the hallway of the house on Aldgate Row and knocked on the wall. Solid. She moved 2 feet to the left and knocked again. Hollow. At each end of the upstairs hallway, a bedroom door opened normally. Between them, an 8-foot stretch of wall with no door, no window, no explanation. She measured the rooms on either side. She did the arithmetic in her notebook. The numbers did not add up. There was space inside this house that did not belong to any room she could enter. The house at 14 Aldgate Row in Clover Creek, Indiana, had been built in 1921. The Stanton family had owned it from 1961 until 1994, when Vera Stanton died at 71. After that, 2 more owners, neither staying longer than 3 years, neither mentioning the wall in any document Willa could find. Either they had not looked carefully enough, or they had looked and chosen not to ask. Willa called a contractor and asked him to remove a small section of plaster at the end of the wall, just enough to see inside. The contractor pulled the section free, and Willa put her flashlight through the gap. No pipes, no wiring, no structural reason for the wall to exist, just dry air undisturbed for decades. And at the far end of the darkness, just inside the reach of the light, the shape of a door. A real door framed and hinge sealed from the inside, with plaster and lath built up against it from within. Someone had entered that room, had sealed the door behind them from the inside, and had left through some other way, or had built the wall first and sealed themselves in with whatever they needed to put in there. There was no other way out. Willa Foss had not wanted a project. She had wanted the cheapest house in a town where her daughter lived, and 14 Aldgate Row on Clover Creek was the cheapest house available. $47,000. She had written the check with the particular steadiness of a person spending money they cannot afford to lose, which is a different steadiness than confidence. It is the steadiness of someone who has already done the calculation and knows there is no version of this where they walk away. The house needed work. She had known that going in. She had budgeted for it the way she budgeted for everything in her life since the back injury had ended her nursing career carefully, without margin, with the awareness that every dollar spent on something unexpected was a dollar not available for something necessary. She was not romantic about the house. It was shelter. It was what she had. She moved in on a Thursday in late October and spent the first 3 days doing what 31 years in emergency medicine had trained her to do with any new environment: assess it systematically before trusting it. She checked the water pressure at every faucet. She ran the furnace through a full cycle and listened for the sounds it made under load. She examined the basement for water staining and the attic for evidence of roof failure and the kitchen ceiling for the brown rings that indicated a slow leak somewhere above. The house was old and imperfect and honest about it. She found no surprises in the basement, no surprises in the attic. The surprise was on the second floor. She found it on the 4th day, a Saturday morning, with a measuring tape and a notebook. She had been planning to buy a runner for the upstairs hallway. The oak floor was cold in the mornings, and she wanted the dimensions before she went to the hardware store. She started at the south end of the hallway at the door to the larger bedroom and walked toward the north end, measuring as she went. The hallway was narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide, with a ceiling low enough that a tall person would have been aware of it. The wallpaper was old, a pale pattern of small flowers that had been painted over at least twice the texture of the original paper, still detectable beneath 2 layers of latex. The floor was the same oak as downstairs, worn to a soft gray along the walking line in the center. She paced it first the way she had always paced unfamiliar spaces before measuring them, an old habit useful for catching inconsistencies before the tape confirmed them. From the south bedroom door to the north bedroom door, she counted 14 steps. She stopped at the north door and looked back. Then she walked it again this time, paying attention to the wall section in the middle, the stretch of hallway between the two bedroom doors that had no door of its own, no window, nothing to interrupt the painted-over wallpaper from one door frame to the other. From the south door to the beginning of that middle section, 9 steps. From the end of that middle section to the north door, 5 steps. 9 and 5 was 14. The hallway was 14 steps end to end. But she was standing in the hallway, and the middle section felt shorter than 9 steps, plus 5 steps should account for. She stood at the south door and looked the length of the hallway, and the arithmetic did not feel right. She got out the measuring tape. The full hallway south door frame to north door frame, 22 feet 4 inches. The larger bedroom interior wall to exterior wall, 13 feet 8 inches. The smaller bedroom interior wall to exterior wall, 10 feet 11 inches. She stood in the hallway and added the numbers. 13 feet 8 plus 10 feet 11 was 24 feet 7 inches. Add the exterior walls, perhaps a foot total. The house at its widest was approximately 25 feet 6 inches across. The hallway was 22 feet 4 inches. 25 feet 6 minus 22 feet 4 was 3 feet 2 inches. Subtract the 2 interior walls, perhaps 8 inches each. That left approximately 1 foot 10 inches, which was roughly what the wall thickness between the hallway and each bedroom should account for. But she had measured the bedrooms from interior wall to interior wall. The interior wall of the larger bedroom was the wall she was standing next to the hallway side. She walked to the middle section and put her hand flat against it. She knocked. Solid. The dense flat sound of plaster backed by something continuous. She moved 2 feet to the right and knocked again. The same sound. She moved another foot. Hollow. A different sound entirely, the lighter resonance of plaster backed by air. She knocked again to be certain. Then she moved along the wall, knocking at every foot, mapping the change. The section in the middle of the hallway, approximately 8 feet centered between the 2 bedroom doors, was hollow behind the plaster. There was a space back there. She went back downstairs and called a contractor she had already been in contact with about the kitchen pipes. She asked him to come by that afternoon. She described what she had found and asked him to look at it. He came at 2 o'clock, knocked on the wall the same way she had listened to the same sounds, and told her there was definitely a cavity. He said it could be an old chase for ductwork that had been closed up, or an original closet that someone had decided to seal rather than demolish, or a construction irregularity from the original build. She asked him to open a small section, just enough to see inside. Not a full demolition, a single cut, perhaps 6 inches by 6 inches near the baseboard at the right end of the hollow section, low enough that it could be patched easily if it turned out to be nothing. He cut it the following morning. The piece of plaster came free in a single section. Behind it, darkness and the smell of air that had been still for a very long time. Dry. Not damp, not moldy, not the particular sourness of a sealed space that had collected moisture over years. Just still. The stillness of a space that had been kept dry by the same conditions that kept the rest of the house dry, held in the same temperature through the same seasons, undisturbed. Willa crouched at the opening and put her flashlight through it. The beam lit a floor oak, boards the same as the hallway, the same wear patterns on the walking line through the center. The ceiling above the floor was full height, not the low clearance of a mechanical chase. This was a room, a real room with floor and ceiling and walls and dimensions she could not yet determine. She moved the flashlight slowly. Left wall, right wall. The beam reached the far end, and there at the far end of the space was a door. A real door paneled the same style as every other interior door in the house, set in a proper frame with proper trim. The hinges were on the inside, visible from where she was crouching. She could see the plate of the top hinge catching the flashlight from 15 feet away. The hinges were on the inside. She held the flashlight steady and looked at the door frame more carefully. The door had been sealed. Along every edge top, both sides, the threshold plaster had been built up against the door from within the room. Not a thin skim coat. A full application, the kind that required work and intention, the kind that took time. The door was not nailed shut. It had been plastered over from the inside. The wall she had been knocking on in the hallway was not the original wall of this space. It was a second layer built against the hallway side of the door, adding another barrier from the outside. Two barriers, one built from inside the room against the door, one built from outside against the hallway wall. Someone had wanted this room closed in both directions. But the inner barrier had been built first. She could see it in the way the plaster layers met at the edge of the door frame, the inner application, older, darker, more settled into the wood. The outer wall had been added later, as if the first ceiling had not felt sufficient. She crouched at the opening for a long time. She was a nurse. She did not frighten easily. She had spent 3 decades in rooms where the worst things happened, and she had learned to stay present in those rooms and do the work regardless of what the room contained. She was not frightened now, but she was very still, because whoever had built the inner wall, the first wall, the one plastered from inside the room against the door, that was the only way in or out, had sealed themselves inside to do it. And after they were done, there was no way out through that door. If you have ever walked into a room and felt that the walls were holding something back, stay with this story, because what was inside that room had been waiting for the right person to crouch at the right opening with a flashlight for the first time in 40 years. Willa did not go back into the hallway that evening. She made dinner, ate at the kitchen table, and looked at her notebook where she had written the measurements in the margins beside her grocery list. 13 feet 8, 10 feet 11, 22 feet 4, the numbers that did not account for the space between the rooms. She was a practical woman, and she approached the situation practically before she opened anything further. She needed to know what she was dealing with legally and structurally. This was her house. Whatever was in that room was now her problem. She drove to the county records office the following Monday morning. The clerk was a young man who found the property file without difficulty. The chain of title for 14 Aldgate Row went back to the original construction in 1921. The Hooper family had built it and owned it until 1961, 4 decades, 2 generations, the ordinary tenure of a family house in a small Indiana town. In March of 1961, the property had transferred to Vera Mae Stanton. It had stayed in her name until her death in 1994, 33 years, and then passed through 2 shorter ownerships before Willa bought it. Willa asked about Vera Stanton's prior address. The clerk checked the transfer documentation. The address listed on the 1961 deed as Vera Stanton's prior residence was a post office box in Indianapolis. No street address, no prior Indiana property records under that name. She had come from somewhere else. Willa asked for all building permits filed for the address between 1961 and 1994. The clerk brought a thin folder. Most properties of that age and size in Clover Creek had accumulated a modest stack of permits over 30 years' roof work. Electrical updates, the small ongoing maintenance of an aging house. The folder for 14 Aldgate Row had 4 permits in 33 years. A roof repair in 1967. Electrical panel upgrade in 1971, water heater replacement in 1982, and 1 more filed in August of 1963. Interior partition modification, 2nd floor, non-load bearing, owner performed. Willa read the line twice. Owner performed. No contractor listed. No inspection record attached, which was not unusual for minor interior work in Indiana. In 1963, the permit had been filed as a courtesy or a requirement, and the modification had been completed without oversight. The description was brief and accurate in the way of someone who understood what information was required and provided exactly that without elaboration. Vera Stanton had filed this permit herself 2 years after moving into the house and had built the wall herself, or had it built without involving any contractor whose name would appear in any record. Willa sat with that for a moment. This was not the work of someone who had discovered a structural problem and patched it hastily. A person who patches a problem does not file a permit. A person who files a permit for interior partition work in 1963 and lists herself as the performing party is a person making a deliberate and documented decision. Vera had wanted this modification on record. She had wanted it to be legal. She had followed the correct process for altering the interior of her house, and she had done it precisely 2 years after she bought the place. Something had happened between 1961 and 1963. Willa asked if there was anyone at the county who had worked there long enough to remember the name Stanton. The clerk thought for a moment and then walked her down the hall to a small office where a woman in her late 70s was going through a box of archived files with the focused attention of someone who has been doing this for 50 years and has not yet run out of things to organize. Her name was Helen, and she had worked for the county in various capacities since 1968. She looked up when Willa gave the name. Mrs. Stanton, Helen said, "On Aldgate Row." She said it the way you say the name of someone you remember accurately but have not thought about in some time. She paid her property taxes on time every year, Helen said, every single year. I processed this office's receivables from 1971 to 1989, and I never once sent a late notice to that address. You remember things like that, not because it's remarkable, because it's consistent. Consistency is what you remember. Willa thanked her and went back to the main records room. She requested the marriage records for the county. The clerk found it in 11 minutes. Vera Mae Collins and Howard James Stanton married June 1953, Clover Creek, Indiana. Howard had been a Clover Creek native. The witnesses listed were local names. The ceremony had been performed at the county courthouse. Willa wrote down the date and looked at it. 1953. 8 years before Vera bought the house on Aldgate Row. 8 years of marriage to Howard before the house, before Clover Creek, before Indiana, because there were no Indiana records for Vera before 1961, which meant she had not been living in Indiana when she married Howard in 1953. She had come from somewhere else. She had married a local man and lived elsewhere for 8 years and then moved to Clover Creek alone. Howard's name did not appear on the 1961 deed and bought a house and 2 years later built a wall. Willa requested a broader search, marriage records under the name Vera Mae Collins outside Indiana prior to 1953. The clerk told her that out-of-state records would require her to search through a genealogical database or contact the relevant county directly. He could give her the access terminal. She sat at the terminal for 40 minutes. She found it in Multnomah County, Oregon. Vera Mae Collins and Ellis Raymond Crane, married April 1948, Portland, Oregon. Willa sat back in the chair. Vera had been married before. In Oregon in 1948, 5 years before she married Howard Stanton in Indiana. There was no divorce record in Multnomah County in the database available to her, which meant either the divorce had been filed in a different county or in a different state, or the records were incomplete or something else entirely that she did not yet have the information to name. She wrote the name down, Ellis Raymond Crane. She had come to the county records office to determine whether her house had a structural problem. She was leaving with a name that no one in the Stanton family appeared to know existed. Willa scheduled the contractor for a Wednesday. She had spent the intervening days going back to the hallway twice more, not to knock on the wall again, not to measure again, but simply to stand in front of it and look at it with what she now knew. Vera Stanton had filed a building permit in August of 1963 and listed herself as the performing party. Whatever was behind this wall had been put there deliberately by a woman who had been married once before in Oregon and had come to Indiana and married again and bought this house, and then 2 years after buying it had decided that something needed to be sealed. The contractor was a man named Dale, who had done her kitchen pipe assessment and who worked carefully and without unnecessary conversation, which was what she wanted. She told him she needed the wall section removed with maximum preservation. She did not want demolition, she wanted access. She wanted to understand what was there before she decided what to do about it. Dale worked from the hallway side, removing the plaster in sections rather than breaking through. He worked from the baseboard up, cutting the lath in clean lines, setting each section aside, rather than letting it fall. The process took most of the morning. Willa stood at the end of the hallway and watched. The opening appeared gradually the way a photograph develops edges, first then the interior coming into focus as more of the wall came away. By 11 o'clock, the opening was large enough to step through. She stepped through. The room was 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a ceiling perhaps 7.5 feet high, lower than the hallway by several inches, which she had not expected. The floor was oak boards, the same as the rest of the second floor, and they were clean. Not dusty in the way of a room that had been abandoned and left to collect whatever settled through the years. Clean in the way of a room that had been swept before it was sealed. The window was on the far wall, a single sash window of the same size and style as the other upstairs windows. It had been painted from the inside white paint applied directly to the glass in a thick, even coat that had dried opaque. No light came through it, and no view of the interior was possible from outside. She had walked around the exterior of the house a dozen times since buying it, and had not noticed this window as different from the others, because from outside it simply looked like a window with the shade drawn. The paint was on the inside surface only invisible from the street. In the center of the room, a chair. A plain wooden chair, the kind found at any kitchen table with a straight back and no cushion. Positioned facing the sealed door, facing the wall she had just come through, as if whoever last sat in it had been sitting facing the way out. Beside the chair, a small table. Pine unfinished, the kind of table sold for a few dollars at any hardware store in 1963. And on the table, a box. It was a tin box, the kind used for butter cookies or holiday candy, rectangular, perhaps 9 inches by 6, with a fitted lid. The color had been green once, a dark institutional green, and the pattern on the lid had faded to the point where she could make out only the suggestion of a decorative border. The lid had been sealed with cloth tape, the kind used for wrapping packages, applied in 3 strips across the top and down the sides, pressed flat and smoothed with intention. She looked at the box for a moment and then looked at the floor. Under the near edge of the table, partially sheltered by the table leg, a piece of paper. Small, perhaps 3 inches by 4, torn from a larger sheet at the top edge. She crouched and picked it up. The handwriting was small and upright, the letters close together, the kind of hand that writes as if space is limited. No one should come in here. No signature, no date, no explanation of what was in the room or why no one should enter it. Just those 6 words written in a hand she did not yet know was Vera's, but would later confirm against the building permit signature she had photographed at the records office. The same upright letters, the same economy of space. She stood and held the paper and looked around the room again. The door. She had seen the door from the hallway side when she looked through the initial opening, the paneled door, the sealed frame, the hinges on the inside. She crossed to it now and looked at it from this side. The door itself was intact. The plaster application against it was visible from this angle, built up in layers against the frame, and the surface of the door smoothed, but not finished, functional rather than decorative. The work of someone sealing something against the possibility of it being opened from outside, not against the possibility of anyone being inside. But the hinges were gone. The hinge plates were still screwed to the door, and to the frame the hardware was there, but the hinge pins had been removed. The 2 halves of each hinge, the door leaf and the frame leaf, had been separated by pulling the pins, and the pins themselves were gone. Without the pins, the door could not swing open even if the plaster were removed. It had been made non-functional from the inside after the plaster was applied as a second measure. And on the floor beside the door, aligned with the baseboard set down with the care of objects being stored rather than discarded, 3 hinge pins laid parallel to one another, evenly spaced. She looked at them for a long time. A woman had entered this room, had applied plaster to the door frame and the door surface from the inside, sealing the door against the hallway, had then removed the hinge pins from the interior side, a task requiring a hammer and a nail set, careful work unhurried, and had laid them on the floor in a line, had written a note and placed it on the floor near the table, had placed a sealed tin box on the table, had sat perhaps in the chair that faced the sealed door, and had then left through the window. There was no other explanation. The window was on the second floor, perhaps 12 feet above the side yard. It was possible, not comfortable, not without risk, but possible to lower yourself from a second-floor window if you were determined to do it. Vera Stanton had been apparently determined. She had sealed the room from the inside, placed everything where she wanted it, and climbed out the window and painted it white afterward from the inside, before she left, or from the outside on a ladder sealing the last evidence of what she had done. And then she had come back inside the house and filed a building permit for an interior partition modification and paid her property taxes on time every year for the next 31 years. Willa picked up the tin box. It was heavier than empty. She tilted it slightly and listened. Not the hard rattle of objects shifting. A softer sound, the slight friction of papers moving against each other, the sound of a box that contained documents rather than things. She set it back on the table. She read the note again. No one should come in here. She thought about the hinge pins on the floor, about the chair facing the sealed door, about the painted window and the filed permit and the taxes paid without a single late notice for 31 years. Vera had not wanted this found. She had also not destroyed it. She had placed it in a room and sealed the room and written a note that said, "No one should enter," which was a different thing from making it impossible to enter. A different thing from burning it, from burying it, from disposing of it in any of the ways available to a woman who owned a house and had 31 years to make things disappear. She had preserved it. She had just asked that no one look. Willa opened the box. Willa set the lid on the table beside the box and looked at what was inside. The contents had been arranged, not packed in haste, not accumulated over time, and left in whatever order they had landed. Arranged. Each item placed with intention, the way a person prepares something they expect to be examined eventually, even if they hope it will not be. She lifted out the top item. A photograph. Black and white, the size of a standard portrait printed on the heavy cardstock used by studios in the late 1940s. Two people standing in front of what appeared to be a courthouse exterior, stone steps, a column visible at the edge of the frame. The woman was in a light-colored suit, a small hat, her hair pinned. The man beside her was perhaps an inch taller in a dark suit, his tie slightly off-center in the way of a man who had dressed carefully and then forgotten about it. Willa had walked past the photographs in the downstairs hallway every day since moving in. She knew Vera Stanton's face from those photographs, the same composed expression in everyone, the woman who had lived in this house for 33 years, looking out from the frames with the consistency of someone who had long ago decided how she wanted to appear in photographs and had simply continued to appear that way. The woman in this photograph was younger and less composed and more present, and it was the same woman. Willa turned the photograph over. Vera and Ellis. Portland. April 12th, 1948. She set the photograph on the table and reached back into the box. The next item was a folded document, heavier paper, official weight. She unfolded it. State of Oregon, Certificate of Dissolution of Marriage, Vera Mae Collins and Ellis Raymond Crane. Dissolved by mutual agreement, March 1952. 4 years. No children listed. The legal language was brief and final in the way that legal language about the end of things tends to be reducing 4 years of a life, shared with another person, to 3 lines of standard text and 2 signatures. She set it beside the photograph. Beneath the dissolution certificate, tied with a piece of blue cloth tape that had been wound twice and knotted with care, were 2 stacks of letters. She lifted them out together and set them on the table. Then she looked at them. Both stacks were letters, but they were not the same letters. The first stack had envelopes, standard white envelopes addressed in a hand. She did not know each one opened cleanly at the top. The return address on each envelope was the same as street address in Portland, Oregon. The name above the address, Ellis R. Crane. There were 9 of them, the postmarks spanning from June 1952 to October 1961. The second stack had no envelopes. 9 pieces of paper folded to the same size as the letters in the first stack, set in order, the edges aligned with the precision of someone who had stacked them many times. There was no address on any of them, no postmark, no envelope anywhere in the box. Willa understood what she was looking at before she opened the first one. She sat down in the chair that faced the sealed door and read Ellis Crane's letters from the beginning. June 1952. 3 months after the dissolution. The handwriting was plain and slightly uneven, the hand of a man who wrote infrequently and was working harder than usual to find the words. He did not understand the ending. He had come home one evening in February, and Vera had been quiet and then quieter, and then she had told him she was leaving, and she had left. and he had not been given an explanation that he could understand, and he was asking now, 3 months later, whether she would tell him what he had done. He was not angry in the letter. He was confused in the specific way of a person who has searched their own memory for the cause of something and cannot find it. September 1952. He had thought about it through the summer. He was sorry he wrote for things he could not name specifically, because he did not know which things had mattered, but he was sorry for all of them regardless. If there had been something he missed, something he should have seen, and hadn't, he was sorry for that too. 1953. He had seen the announcement in the newspaper. A friend had sent it to him. He wished her happiness with her new husband. He meant it, he wrote, even though he was aware it was a strange thing to say, and he was not certain he could explain how he could mean it. He meant it. 1955. A shorter letter. He was still in Portland. He was working at the same yard. He thought about her sometimes and wondered if she was well. He hoped she was well. 1957. Shorter still. He had been ill in the spring but was recovered. He did not know why he was telling her this. He thought she might want to know, and then he thought she probably did not, and then he sent the letter anyway. 1959. 3 sentences. He hoped this letter found her in good health. He thought of her on April 12th. He did not know why he kept writing and had decided to stop questioning it. 1961. The last one. The handwriting was the same, but the pressure was lighter, the way handwriting looks when the person writing it is tired, in a way that has become permanent rather than temporary. He was not going to write again, he said. Not because he had stopped caring, but because he had come to understand that silence was also an answer, and he had been holding that answer long enough to know what it meant. He wished her well. He hoped the house was good to her. He had read that she had moved to Indiana. He did not say how. He hoped Indiana was what she had needed it to be. Willa set the last letter down. 9 letters over 9 years, each one shorter than the last, each one asking less than the previous one had asked, until the final letter asked nothing at all and only said goodbye in the way of a man who had learned slowly and without help that goodbye was what was being said. She picked up the second stack. The paper was the same as the letters in the first stack, standard household stationery, the kind kept in a desk drawer for correspondence. The handwriting was the upright, close-lettered hand from the note on the floor, Vera's hand. The first response was dated July 1952, a month after Ellis's first letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged that he deserved an explanation. The second paragraph began the explanation. The third paragraph stopped in the middle of a sentence, and the rest of the page was blank. No, not stopped. Continued on the next sheet. Willa found the second sheet tucked behind the first. Vera had written, "I left because Margaret Crane came to our house in February and told me things that I could not know were true or not true, and I could not stay to find out." Willa stopped. She read the sentence again. Margaret Crane. Not Ellis. A third person, someone who had come to the house in February of 1952, someone whose name was Crane, the same name as Ellis, which meant a relation, a sister or a mother, or someone connected to him by blood or marriage. And this person had come to Vera's house and said something. Had said things that Vera could not verify and could not dismiss and could not stay in the same house and the same life and the same marriage without eventually having to know the answer to. And so she had left without asking Ellis. And Ellis had written for 9 years asking what he had done. And Vera had written 9 answers that she had never put in an envelope. Willa held the response letter and looked at the window painted white from the inside, the afternoon light pressing dimly through the paint, and thought about a woman who had carried this room in her house for 31 years, who had paid her taxes on time every year, who had kept the door sealed, and the box on the table and the note on the floor, and who had never once in 31 years opened the wall and gone in to read what was written on those pages she had already read many times before. Vera had written 9 answers in 9 years and had not sent one of them. Not once. Not a single time when she had finished writing and thought, this time I will fold it and address it and put it in the box at the end of the drive. The question was not why she had not sent them. Willa had been a nurse for 31 years, and she knew why people did not send the things they wrote. The question was why she had kept writing. And the answer to that, Willa thought sitting in the chair that faced the sealed door with the letters in her lap, was the same answer it always was. Because the writing was not for Ellis. It was for Vera. Willa went back downstairs with the tin box and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She had a name now. Margaret Crane, Portland, Oregon, 1952. A woman who had come to a house on a February evening and said something to a young wife that the young wife had carried for the rest of her life without ever repeating it to anyone. She started with the Multnomah County Records database she had used the day before. The search took longer than she expected. Margaret Crane was not an uncommon combination of names, and the Portland records from that era were partially digitized, the gaps filled in with scanned documents of variable quality. She narrowed the search by decade, by county, by the approximate age a woman would need to have been in 1952 to have an adult son. She found the obituary in a digitized archive of a Portland community newspaper. It was brief, the length of an obituary for someone without institutional prominence, a private person memorialized in the column inches available to private people. Margaret Louise Crane, née Howell, born 1911, died 1979, age 68. She had been a resident of Portland for most of her adult life. She had worked in school administration. She was preceded in death by her husband Robert Crane, who had died in 1961. She was survived by her son Ellis Raymond Crane of Portland, Oregon. Willa sat back in her chair. Ellis's mother. Margaret Crane had been Ellis's mother, which meant the woman who had come to Vera's house on a February evening in 1952 and said the things that ended the marriage had been Ellis's own mother, had come without Ellis knowing, or with his knowledge Vera's letters did not specify, had stood in the house where her son lived with his wife, and had said things that Vera described only as things she could not know were true or not true, and then had left, and Ellis had written for 9 years asking what he had done. Willa opened the stack of Vera's unsent responses and read through them again more slowly this time, looking for anything she had moved past too quickly in the first reading. The 1952 response she already knew. The explanation that stopped at Margaret's name and the words that followed it, things I could not know were true or not true, and I could not stay to find out. She moved to 1955. Vera had written, I think about what she said to me. I did not ask you because I did not want the answer if it was yes. I did not ask her because she had said what she came to say and left. I have had only those words in my head for 3 years, and nothing to put beside them. Willa read the sentence again. I did not want the answer if it was yes. Whatever Margaret Crane had said, it had been something that could be true or false, something that had a yes or no available to it, something that Vera had decided she would rather not know the answer to than risk hearing yes. She had left her husband rather than ask him the question his mother had made it necessary to ask. She turned to the 1957 response. Brief as Ellis's letter that year had been brief. Vera had written only, I wonder sometimes if you found out what she told me. I wonder if you understood afterward why I went. And then 1959, the one Willa had read in the room. Howard is a good man. He does not know that I think of you sometimes not in a romantic way, only in the way of someone who was never allowed to say goodbye properly. Willa set the letter down and looked at the window above the kitchen sink. The backyard was visible through it, the side of the house, the line of the fence, and above the fence the upper story of 14 Aldgate Row, with the painted window on the second floor, white and blank from the outside. Never allowed to say goodbye properly. Vera had not written never said goodbye. She had written never allowed. The passive construction of someone describing a thing done to them rather than a choice they made. Whatever Margaret Crane had said on that February evening had not just ended the marriage, it had taken the goodbye with it, had made a clean ending impossible, because the ending had been built on something Vera could neither confirm nor dismiss, and so she had carried it forward into the next life she made, into the house on Aldgate Row, into the room she had sealed with plaster and cloth tape, and a note that said, no one should come in here. She picked up her phone and found the number she had written in her notebook 2 days earlier after a brief search. Patricia Stanton Muir, Indianapolis. Vera and Howard's oldest daughter, 71 years old, listed in the county directory. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. Willa introduced herself. She explained that she had bought the house on Aldgate Row. She said she had found something during renovation that she thought Patricia should know about, and she described it as carefully as she could. The room, the sealed door, the tin box, the contents. She did not editorialize. She was a nurse, and she had learned to present difficult information plainly and let the person receiving it find their own footing before she continued. Patricia Stanton Muir was quiet through most of it. When Willa finished, she asked, "Did your mother ever mention living in Oregon?" Patricia said she never mentioned Oregon at all. "Not once in my entire life." Willa said, "Do you know the name Ellis Crane?" The silence was long enough that Willa looked at her phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. Then Patricia said, No, I don't know that name. Who is he?" Willa told her. Another silence. Shorter this time, the silence of someone rearranging rather than absorbing. "Patricia said she was married before my father. She never said anything about that." Willa said, "I know. I found the dissolution certificate in the box." Patricia said, "What else is in the letters?" "What did she write?" Willa said she wrote about why she left Oregon. She didn't go into full detail, but she mentioned a woman named Margaret Crane, who came to the house in 1952 and told her something. Vera wrote that she left because she couldn't verify what Margaret told her and couldn't stay without knowing. Patricia was quiet again. Then she said, "Did my mother write what Margaret told her?" "In the letters." Willa said not directly. She only wrote that it was something that could have been true or not true, and she didn't want to find out which. Patricia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Can I come?" Willa said yes. Patricia said, "I want to read what she wrote when she didn't think anyone would read it. I want to read what my mother wrote when she was only writing for herself." She paused. "My whole life," Patricia said, "my mother was the most private person I knew. She was not cold. She was present. She was consistent. She was there every day in all the ways that matter. But there was always something she kept back, some room she didn't open, and I thought that was just who she was." She stopped. "I would like to come and read those letters," she said, "and I would like to see the room." Willa called Roy Dempsey on a Thursday afternoon. She had found his name through a neighbor 2 streets over who had lived in Clover Creek her entire life and knew everyone who had delivered mail in the town going back 40 years. Roy Dempsey, she said, retired, still lives on Sycamore, delivered for this end of town from sometime in the late 50s until he retired in the early 90s. If anyone remembers that house, it would be Roy. Roy answered on the second ring and agreed to talk when Willa explained what she was looking into. He said to come by that afternoon if she wanted. He said he had nothing pressing and that he remembered most of his route better than he remembered things that had happened last week, which was just how memory worked when you were 78. His house was 4 blocks from Aldgate Row. The front porch had 2 chairs and a small table, and the particular settled quality of a porch that had been used consistently for decades. He was already outside when Willa arrived, a tall man gone thin with age, with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years walking the same streets at the same pace and had never entirely stopped. She told him the address. He nodded before she finished saying it. "Number 14, he said. "Stanton House, Mrs. Stanton." He said it the way people say names from a route they walked for 30 years with the automatic accuracy of a catalog, the way addresses and names had filed themselves into a particular kind of long-term memory built from daily repetition. She didn't get much mail, Roy said. Some people on that route you needed both hands to carry what came in a week. Mrs. Stanton was the other kind. Bills, the occasional piece of official correspondence, maybe a card at Christmas from someone. She hadn't subscribed to anything, hadn't ordered by catalog, hadn't been the kind of person whose name got passed around to mailing lists. He looked out at the street. "But I remember one time," he said. "Early 60s, I couldn't tell you the exact year. I remember it was warm enough that she was outside when I came by, standing at the box, not waiting exactly just there. I handed it to her directly, rather than putting it in the box." He paused. "One envelope," he said. "Return address was Oregon. I remember Oregon because it was the only piece of mail I ever saw go to that house from out of state in all the years I did the route. Willa said, "What did she do with it?" Roy said she looked at it, looked at the return address, she turned it over, looked at the front again, the way you do when you're reading who it's from, before you decide what to do with it. And then she went inside. He shifted in his chair. She didn't open it at the box, he said. Most people, even if they're going inside anyway, they at least look at the front of the envelope one more time or tear the corner. She just carried it in, didn't look back. I went on to the next house. He stopped. But I looked back, he said. I don't know why. I was at my next stop putting the mail in the box at number 16, and I looked back at the Stanton house. Just a habit, I suppose, noticing things on the route. Willa waited. The upstairs window, Roy said. The one at the end of the hall facing the side yard. It lit up. The light came on in there. I noticed because in all the years I'd been doing that route, I had never seen a light in that particular window. The other rooms upstairs occasionally, but not that one. He folded his hands on the arm of the chair. It was on for a while, he said. I finished the next few houses and came back past on my way to the truck, and the light was still on. That's all I remember. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was a lit window. Willa sat with that. She knew now that the letter Roy had described was the last one. October 1961. The one in which Ellis had written that he would not write again, not because he had stopped caring, but because silence was also an answer, and he had held it long enough to know what it meant. The envelope that Vera had carried into the house without opening at the box, she had known from the Portland return address, from the handwriting she had been reading for 9 years, exactly what was inside before she broke the seal. She had carried it inside because she always carried them inside. She had been reading Ellis Crane's letters for 9 years, and she had not once left them unopened. She had read it, and then she had gone into the room at the end of the hall and turned on the light, the room that was not yet sealed, the room that still had its door and its hinges and its window without paint on the glass. She had gone in there with the last letter from the man she had left without explanation, and she had sat in that room, perhaps, in the same chair that was still there 60 years later, and she had done whatever a person does when they receive the last letter they will ever receive from someone they never properly said goodbye to. And then she had come back out, and 2 years had passed. Willa thought about those 2 years. 1961 to 1963. She had the building permit August 1963. Vera had held the open room and the tin box and the 9 unsent letters for 2 years after the last letter arrived. She had walked past the door at the end of the hall twice a day for 2 years, going from one bedroom to the other, knowing what was in the room behind the door, and knowing that the door could be opened. Something had happened in those 2 years, or nothing had happened, or time itself had finally done what time does with things that have been held too long, settled them into a permanence that made the uncertainty of an open door feel worse than the certainty of a sealed one. In August of 1963, Vera Stanton had gone to the county offices and filed a building permit for an interior partition modification, non-load-bearing owner performed. And then she had gone home and gone into the room for the last time and done what she had decided to do. Roy said you found something in the house, in that room. Willa said yes. He nodded slowly, not surprised. The nod of a man who had delivered mail for 30 years and had understood in the way of people who moved through other people's lives at the edges that houses held more than they showed. She bought that house in 61, he said. Moved in alone. No husband at first. Howard came later that year or the next. She was quiet from the first day I delivered to her. Not unfriendly, just the kind of quiet that's been practiced. He looked out at the street again. I always thought she'd had something happen to her before she came here, he said. You deliver to a person for 30 years, you develop a sense of things. Some people are quiet because that's their nature. Some people are quiet because they're holding something still. He was quiet himself for a moment. That light in the window, he said. I've thought of it once or twice over the years without knowing why it stayed with me. Just a lit window. It shouldn't mean anything. Willa looked down the street in the direction of Aldgate Row, the roof of number 14 just visible above the intervening houses. Vera had gone into that room after the last letter and turned on the light. She had sat in there with 9 years of correspondence and 9 unsent answers in a tin box, and the light had been on long enough for a mail carrier to finish 4 more houses and come back past on his way to his truck. And then the light had gone off. And 2 years later, the room had been sealed. If you have ever sat with something you could not send and could not throw away and did not know what else to do with, tell us in the comments, because that is what Vera Stanton did in that room. And Willa was only now beginning to understand how long she had been doing it. Patricia Muir drove 3 hours from Indianapolis and arrived at 10:30 on a Saturday morning. She was 71 years old, and she had her mother's upright posture and her mother's economy of movement, the quality of a person who had learned early to take up exactly the space required and no more. She stood on the porch of 14 Aldgate Row and looked at the exterior of the house for a moment before Willa opened the door, the way you look at a place you are trying to reconcile with a version of it you carry in your head. She had never been to this house. Vera had bought it in 1961, before Patricia was born. By the time Patricia existed, the house on Aldgate Row was simply where her mother lived, a place she visited at holidays and occasional weekends, a place that had always been her mother's in the particular way that parents' houses are their own world, that children inhabit as guests. Willa brought her upstairs first. She had decided to show her the room before she showed her the box. She wanted Patricia to understand the physical fact of it, the wall, the sealed door, the deliberate architecture of what her mother had done before she encountered the contents. It seemed important to establish that this had been a decision, not an accident, not a collapse or a failure, but a considered act by a woman who filed building permits and paid her taxes on time. Patricia stood in the hallway in front of the opening where the plaster had been removed and looked into the room. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The contractor had left the room intact after opening the wall. Willa had asked him to take the outer plaster down and nothing else. The chair was still there, still facing the sealed door. The table was still there. The window had been unblocked. Willa had carefully removed the white paint from the glass with a heat gun 2 days earlier, restoring the light, and the room now received the thin October sun from the side yard, the same light it would have received in 1963 before Vera sealed it. The hinge pins were still on the floor in their line beside the door. Patricia looked at them. Then she said she took the hinges out herself. Willa said the pins. She left the plates on the door and the frame. Just remove the pins and set them down. Patricia looked at the line of 3 pins on the floor, parallel, evenly spaced, placed with the care of someone who was not in a hurry. She said that's exactly how she would have done it. They went back downstairs. Willa put the tin box on the kitchen table and set the 2 stacks of letters beside it. Ellis's 9 letters in their opened envelopes, Vera's 9 responses folded but never sent. She told Patricia she would be in the front room and that there was no hurry and that she should take as long as she needed. Then she left Patricia alone with it and went to sit in the front room with a cup of coffee that went cold while she waited. She did not hear much from the kitchen. The occasional sound of paper, the particular quiet of a room where someone is reading something that requires their complete attention. Once after perhaps 40 minutes, a longer silence that had a different quality than the other silences, and then the sound of paper again. An hour and a half after she had sat down at the kitchen table, Patricia came into the front room. She sat in the chair across from Willa and looked out the window at the street for a moment. Her hands were in her lap. She had the expression of someone who has received information that has not devastated them, but has permanently altered something in the architecture of what they thought they knew. She did not cry. She said she never knew the answer. About what Margaret Crane said to her, she left because she couldn't know for certain, and she kept all of this because she couldn't forget that she hadn't been certain. She was quiet for a moment. I think she wanted someone to know that Patricia said. Not me, I'm her daughter, she would never have told me. But someone without a reason to judge her for it. Willa said, "What did you think of the letters she wrote back?" Patricia said, "I thought they sounded like her. The ones she wrote to him sounded more like her than almost anything I heard her say out loud in my entire life. She was always precise with words. She chose them very carefully. But in those letters, she was precise about things she never let herself be precise about in front of anyone. She looked down at her hands. She wrote to him about not being allowed to say goodbye properly, Patricia said. I read that 3 times. Because that was the thing, she never got a proper ending. Margaret Crane came and said what she said and left, and Ellis never knew what had happened, and Vera left without asking him whether it was true, and then he wrote for 9 years, and she answered for 9 years without sending any of it. And the whole time she was living her life here with my father, with me, with all of it, she was also carrying this room. She said room the way you say a word when you mean something larger than the word. My father was a good man, Patricia said. Patient, steady, not curious about things that didn't concern him. I think he probably knew there was something she didn't talk about. I think he chose not to ask because asking would have required her to either tell him or lie to him, and he didn't want to put her in that position. That's who he was. She looked back at the window. They were both carrying something for each other, she said, in different ways. After a moment, Willa said, there is one more thing I should tell you about Ellis. Patricia looked at her. Willa said I found an obituary for him in the Portland archive. He died in 1988. Patricia was quiet. Then she said, did he have family? Willa looked at her notes on the table beside her. She had printed the obituary 2 days earlier in anticipation of this conversation. She read the relevant line. No immediate survivors listed, she said. Patricia said, so there's no one left to tell. Willa said no. Patricia looked at the table, then out the window again. The street was quiet. A Saturday morning in October, the trees at the end of the block showing the last of their color. She said, so there's no one alive who knew him and loved him, who could be told that she did write back, that she wrote back every single time and never sent it. Willa said, no, there's no one like that left. Patricia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, but there's still something to do. She said it with the steadiness of her mother's posture and her mother's economy, and something else underneath it that was entirely her own. Patricia left at 2 o'clock that afternoon with the tin box under her arm. She had wrapped it in the cloth she found in the kitchen drawer that Willa offered her, the same way you wrap something you intend to carry carefully with both hands for a long distance. She stood on the porch for a moment before going to her car and looked at the front of the house the way she had looked at it when she arrived, with the particular attention of someone trying to fix a place in their memory with more accuracy than they had managed the first time. She said, I'm not going to archive these or donate them anywhere. I'm not going to do anything official with them. Willa said she understood. Patricia said my mother kept them for 40 years. I can keep them a while longer. She looked at the house one more time. Then she got in her car and drove back to Indianapolis. Willa went inside and stood in the downstairs hallway for a moment and then went upstairs. She stood at the opening where the wall had been and looked into the room. The contractor came back the following week to finish what needed finishing. The edge of the opening squared and trimmed the floor, sanded where the demolition had roughed it, the window frame cleaned of the last traces of paint residue. He asked if she wanted to drywall it back in as a proper room with a closet, or whether she had other plans. She told him to leave the walls as they were. The original plaster where it had survived stayed. The section that had been the outer partition came down entirely, widening the hallway entrance into the room by a few feet, enough that it opened naturally off the corridor rather than requiring a door. She did not add a door. She moved the chair from the center of the room to the corner by the window. She had a small bookshelf she had not yet found a place for, and she put it along the interior wall, filling it with the books she had been stacking on the bedroom floor since moving in. She bought nothing new for the room. She used what she had. The window faced the side yard and caught the afternoon light from the west in the later hours of the day. It was good light for reading, the kind of light that comes in at a low angle and lies across a page in a way that makes you want to stay in the chair longer than you planned. She found a small rug at a second-hand shop and put it on the floor. The oak boards underneath it were the same oak as the rest of the second floor, worn in the same walking line down the center where someone had crossed the room the same way enough times that the wood remembered the path. She kept the note. No one should come in here. She had taken it from the floor the day she opened the room, and she had not known what to do with it. She did not want to throw it away, and she did not want to display it. She folded it once and put it in the small drawer of the table she had moved to the corner beside the chair. Closed the drawer. It was there if she wanted to take it out. It was not visible if she did not. The hinge pins she left on the floor where Vera had placed them. She had thought about moving them and had not. They were part of what had happened in that room, and she did not feel it was her place to rearrange what Vera had arranged. She went to that room most evenings now. She sat in the chair with a book and the afternoon light and the particular quiet of a room that had been closed for a long time and was now open. It was a good room to sit in. It had the quality of a room that had been waiting patiently and was not surprised to finally have someone in it. 3 weeks after Patricia's visit, a postcard arrived in the mailbox. Indianapolis postmark. Willa's name and address in a hand she recognized from 3 hours across a kitchen table. She turned it over. No long message. Patricia had written 4 sentences. I have read the letters 3 more times. I think I understand my mother better now than I did when she was alive. That is a strange thing to say, and I mean it completely. Thank you for calling me. My mother would be glad someone finally went in. Willa read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. My mother would be glad someone finally went in. She thought about Vera Stanton filing a building permit in August of 1963 and listing herself as the performing party, writing out the description in her careful, upright hand. Interior partition modification, second floor non-load-bearing owner performed. Going home and doing the work, and then living in the house beside the sealed room for 31 more years. Paying her taxes on time. Being the kind of neighbor people remembered for consistency rather than for anything they could explain. She had written no one should come in here, and she had made the tin box and placed it on the table and put the letters inside in order and sealed the lid with cloth tape pressed flat and smoothed carefully at the edges. She had told no one to come in. She had left everything necessary for someone to understand what was there. These were not the same instruction. Willa picked up the postcard and carried it upstairs and put it on the bookshelf in the small room, leaning against the spines of the books facing out. It was the only thing on the shelf that was not a book. It looked right there. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the room. The light was coming in at the low western angle of late afternoon, the same light it had always found when there was nothing to keep it out. It lay across the floor in the particular warm way of October light, touching the edge of the rug, reaching the chair leg, climbing slightly up the wall. Vera Stanton built that wall alone in 1963, 2 years after the last letter from the man she had left without explanation. She carried the note up the stairs and placed it on the floor. She placed the tin box on the table. She removed the hinge pins and set them down in a line. She sealed the door from the inside and climbed out the window and came back into her life and lived it for 31 more years. She left a note that said no one should come in. She left everything inside in perfect order. She had known someone would come eventually. She could not be the one to open that door. Not for Ellis, not for Howard, not for her children, not for herself. Some things can only be seen clearly by someone who was never in the room to begin with, someone who would find the tin box without knowing what it cost to fill it, someone who would read the letters without needing to forgive anyone for what was in them. She had waited for that person. She had built the wall and set the box on the table and written her note and trusted that the house would hold what she could not, for as long as it needed to, until the right person came along and bought the cheapest house in town and knocked on a wall that sounded different from the one beside it. The next story is waiting, another house, another sealed room, another truth that has been patient far longer than it should have had to be. It is in the playlist right here.